The obsidian courtyard of Ravenspire had never witnessed silence this absolute. Seren pressed herself deeper into the recess of the upper gallery, her fingertips white against the carved stone balustrade as she looked down at the assembled kingdom below. Hundreds of torches burned along the ancient walls, casting the courtyard in restless waves of amber and shadow. Pack leaders from all 7 territories stood in their designated circles, their ceremonial sashes marking bloodlines that stretched back centuries. Elders in pale robes occupied the innermost ring. Warriors lined the perimeter in absolute stillness. Even the children of the court had been brought down for this, wrapped in winter wool, their faces tipped upward with the deep reverence of those who understood. They were witnessing something their grandchildren would one day ask them about. This was the rite of the hollow moon. Performed once in every Alpha King's reign, the rite demanded that the sovereign stand before his assembled packs, beneath the full winter moon, and speak aloud the name of his bonded mate. The bond between a true alpha and his mate was not something that bent to politics or bloodlines or the careful calculations of noble houses. It chose, and the king was bound by a covenant older than the territories themselves, to declare it before the moon reached its apex. Kaelin had told her it would be tonight. He had said it in the old observatory 3 months ago, his voice low and unhurried in the way it always was when he was most certain of something. He had taken her wrist between his hands and pressed his lips to the mark he had placed there on an evening when the world had contracted to the two of them, and the bond had ignited between them like something that had been waiting a very long time for permission. He had told her she was his bonded. That fate had written her name into his blood before either of them had known what to do with it. That nothing could unmake what had already been sealed between them. She had believed him with the complete belief of someone who had no reason not to. Seren's grip tightened on the balustrade as the ceremony below arrived at its center. The High Elder raised both hands, his white robes pooling around him on the ancient stone, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with a clarity that seemed to exceed what a human throat should produce. Kaelin, Alpha King of the Ravenspire bloodline, holder of the Hollow Moon Covenant, the rite demands its answer. Speak the name of your bonded, and let the covenant be honored. The courtyard held its breath. Seren looked at Kaelin standing on the raised ceremonial platform at the center of the space below. He wore the black and silver of the bloodline, the ceremonial weight of the office visible in every detail of his presentation. She could see the line of his jaw from this height, the dark hair that had always fallen slightly forward when he bent over the territory maps he loved to argue over, the set of his shoulders that she had learned to read the way others read weather. She had spent 4 months learning the specific language of him, the way his hands stilled completely when he was listening to something that truly mattered, the way his voice dropped half a register when he was angry rather than rising as most people did, the way he had looked at her the night the bond had declared itself, as if he was seeing something he had almost stopped believing existed. "You are my bonded, Seren," he had told her, his hands cupping her face with a carefulness that had broken something open in her chest. "The bond does not lie. You will stand beside me before all of them. I give you my word." Now she watched him stand motionless on the platform, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. A woman ascended the platform steps from the eastern approach, and the crowd below released a collective sound that was not quite cheering but was not far from it. She was extraordinary in the way that certain women were extraordinary, as if their entire lives had been a preparation for being looked at in exactly this kind of light. Silver pale hair arranged in the ceremonial style of a prospective bonded, a gown the color of winter frost that caught the torchlight in calculated ways. She moved with the assurance of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times that it had stopped feeling like a ceremony and started feeling like an arrival. Seraphine of House Morin, the eldest daughter of Lord Davith Morin, whose family controlled 3 of the 7 territories and had been angling for proximity to the crown for as long as anyone could remember. The mark on Seren's wrist began to burn. It started as warmth and deepened into something that radiated upward through her arm and into her chest. She pressed her free hand flat against the stone of the balustrade to anchor herself, clenching her teeth against the sound that tried to push its way up her throat. Around her wrist, where Kaylin's claiming mark sat in its silver pale scar, the skin had gone hot enough to feel feverish. Kaylin stepped forward. She noticed it immediately, in the way that only months of close attention makes possible. Something was wrong with the way he was moving. The fluid, unhurried certainty she had come to know so well had been replaced by something mechanical and constrained, as if each movement was being produced by deliberate effort rather than instinct. His posture was rigid in a way that was not composure, but something closer to containment. And his eyes, the dark eyes that had burned with something fierce and intent every single time they had found her face across a room, were empty. Not cold, not indifferent. Empty, in the way of a room from which all the furniture has been removed. As if whatever animated the man she knew had been taken somewhere very far away, and something hollow had been left to wear his form. She told herself she was seeing what grief wanted her to see. She told herself she was inventing explanations because the alternative meant accepting that every word he had ever spoken to her had been a performance. She watched him step toward Seraphine. "I name." His voice rang across the silent courtyard, and Seren heard the hollowness in it even from this height. "Seraphine of House Morin. Let the hollow moon bear witness." The courtyard erupted. The sound of it rolled upward through the stone like a physical force, all those voices releasing the tension of a collective breath held for months. The political alliance that 3 generations of Morins had worked to engineer had arrived exactly as they had always planned it would. And the joy below was the uncomplicated joy of people watching a story conclude in precisely the way they expected. Seren did not move. She stood in the upper gallery with her hands gripping the stone and felt something inside her do the only thing it could in a moment that exceeded what shock was designed to handle. It simply stopped. Like a clock, whose mechanism had ceased without any external force, leaving behind only the silence where the ticking used to be. The mark on her wrist went from burning to tearing, a sensation so acute it felt less like pain and more like something being extracted from beneath her skin by force. She ran before she decided to run. The upper passages were empty, every member of the household having descended for the ceremony. Seren moved through them without light, one hand trailing the wall for guidance, the other pressed hard against her wrist where the mark continued its agonized pulse. She reached the small set of rooms near the east wing where she had spent 4 months waiting to be named, and she did not stop until the door was closed behind her, and the darkness had absorbed her completely. For a long moment she simply stood there. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the celebration bonfires being lit across the fortress grounds below, their orange light blooming against the winter dark with cheerful indifference. In the courtyard, she could still hear the howls rising into the cold sky. She pressed her palm flat against the frosted glass. She did not see the figure on the highest tower of Ravenspire. She did not see the hands gripping the stone parapet hard enough to fracture it, the dark eyes blazing with something desperate and wild at odds with the man who had just spoken another woman's name before 10,000 witnesses. And she did not hear the sound that tore itself from him in the moment he felt her mark go cold against the bond. It was not a word. It was not a howl. It was something older than either, and it split the winter sky above Ravenspire like a wound that had no intention of closing. By the time the sound faded, Seren was already packing. She did not take much. Seren moved through her small rooms with the focused efficiency of someone who had already decided that survival required leaving most things behind. A few changes of clothing. Her grandmother's ring, worn on a cord around her neck rather than on her finger, because her fingers had swollen in the past weeks, and she had not yet let herself think about why. Her healer's satchel, worn leather and held together with a repaired strap, which she had carried since her training and could not bring herself to leave. The traveling cloak that had kept her warm through 2 mountain winters. She left everything else. She was nearly at the door when the second wave of nausea stopped her. It had been arriving in waves for 6 weeks, coming without warning and departing just as suddenly, and she had been telling herself it was grief, that the body expressed what the mind refused to process, that her system was simply registering the sustained tension of waiting for a ceremony that had not gone the way she had been promised. She pressed her hand to the wall and waited for it to pass. It did not pass. What arrived instead, as she stood in the darkness of her room with the celebration sounds rising through the stones from below, was something she had been carefully and deliberately not knowing for longer than was reasonable. 2 heartbeats. She had heard them before, in the quiet hours when everything else went still, had felt the dual presence of them, the faint synchrony, and the way the second one seemed to answer the first with a rhythm that was slightly faster and slightly wilder, as if the two of them were already in conversation with each other in a language that had no need for words. She had filed it under things she could not afford to examine until she was safe, until the ceremony was behind her, until there was space to think clearly. There was no longer any space to wait. Seren pressed both hands to her abdomen and understood that she was not leaving Ravenspire alone. She sat down on the edge of the bed in the darkness, and for a long moment she simply breathed. 2 heartbeats. 2 separate presences, already distinct from each other, one steadier and one wilder, one that leaned toward warmth and one that crackled at its edges with something untamed and restless. His children, both of them, growing inside her while he stood in the courtyard below and named another woman before the entire kingdom. The sob that rose in her chest did not make it past her throat. She did not allow it to. She was going to need everything she had for what came next, and she could not afford to spend it here. Seren rose, lifted her bags, and crossed to the window one final time. She pressed her palm flat against the frosted glass. "I do not know yet what I am going to do," she whispered. "I do not know where we are going or what any of this means. But I need you to know that I am not afraid. Whatever happened down there tonight, nothing done to us in that courtyard changes what you are. You are wanted. Both of you. You are the most wanted thing in the world." She held her palm against the glass for a long moment, feeling the cold seep through her skin. Then she pulled her cloak tight, shouldered her bags, and slipped through the servants' passage that she had spent 4 months learning precisely because she had always understood, somewhere beneath the hope, that she might need to leave quickly. The second heartbeat, the wild one, pressed against her palm as she stepped out into the cold. She did not look back. She did not see the mark on her wrist flare with sudden heat as she passed beneath the tower, as if something above her had felt her moving away and was reaching for her through the only channel still open between them. She walked into the winter dark, carrying 2 secrets, and behind her Ravenspire blazed with celebration fires that burned all night and asked no questions about what they were mourning. 2 months later, the Ashvale estate had almost finished teaching Seren how to be quiet. She had arrived in the first week of deep winter, half frozen and carrying nothing but her satchel and the knowledge that she needed somewhere no one would think to look. The estate had belonged to a distant branch of a bloodline that had died out 3 generations back, its lands folded into the holdings of a minor lord who had never bothered to do anything with the sprawling old house at the edge of the Ashvale forest except forget it existed. The caretaker who had maintained it for decades had moved on the previous autumn. The position had gone unfilled. Seren had filled it. She had introduced herself to the factor who managed the absent lord's affairs as a widow, seeking quiet work and modest lodging, her condition evident enough that the man had asked no difficult questions and filed no careful records. The house was cold, and several of its rooms were water damaged, and the entire east wing had partially collapsed inward at some point in the previous decade. But it was isolated, and it was hers, and no one came here looking for anything. That was all she needed. She had a routine now. She kept the inhabited portions of the house in adequate order. She maintained the grounds immediately surrounding it well enough to satisfy the quarterly inspection the factor conducted by letter rather than in person. She grew what she could in the small kitchen garden and acquired the rest from the village market 7 miles down the valley road, where she was known only as the quiet woman from the old Ashvale house who paid in coin and asked no questions about anything. She did not use her name. She did not use her healing skills beyond what was strictly necessary, because a healer of her ability attracted exactly the kind of attention she could not afford. She tended her own condition and nothing else. The children were growing. She could feel them clearly now, their presences distinct and increasingly communicative in the wordless way of beings who had not yet found language, but had found something older. The steadier one responded to her voice when she spoke aloud in the evenings. The wilder one responded to something else entirely. To whatever remained of the bond. To whatever was still alive in the connection between her and the man she was trying very hard not to think about. Because the bond had not faded. This was what had frightened her most in those first weeks, and what still frightened her now in the way of things that have become familiar without becoming less alarming. Among the bonded, separation was supposed to resolve itself over time. The claiming mark was supposed to dim as the bond weakened and eventually dissolve into unmarked skin, leaving behind nothing except the memory of what it had been. She had seen it happen. She had treated the ache of dissolved bonds as a healer and understood the physiology of it completely. Her mark was not fading, it was darkening. The silver pale scar on her wrist had deepened over the past 2 months into something richer and more complex, the lines of it thickening slightly, the edges sharper than they had been the night she received it. She examined it every morning in the pale winter light from the kitchen window and told herself there was a reasonable explanation. That her condition was affecting her body's natural processes, that she was simply one of those cases where the bond's dissolution took longer than normal. But some nights, when the house was fully dark and the children had stilled and everything that could distract her had run out, she felt something through the mark she could not explain away. A presence, distant and fragmented, like a voice heard through several walls. Something that pushed against the edges of the connection between them with a quality that was not peace. Something restless and searching and, beneath all of that, something that ached with a frequency she recognized because it matched her own exactly. She always pushed the awareness away before it could become something she depended on. False comfort was a particular kind of cruelty, and she had already survived one devastation. She would not construct herself a second one. On the 43rd night at Ashvale, she named them. She had been putting it off in the way of someone who understands that naming a thing makes it real in a way that cannot be undone. But she was sitting by the fire with her hands resting on her belly, and both of them were moving, the steady one and the wild one, and it seemed suddenly unkind to keep calling them by their rhythms rather than their names. She chose names that were hers alone to give. Names that carried none of his history and all of her love and something of the people they were already announcing themselves to be. She spoke them quietly into the fire-lit room. No one heard them but her and the children, and the walls of the old house, and the dark forest beyond the window. She did not tell herself that everything would be fine. She told herself that she was still here, that they were still here, and that for now, that was enough. But in the east wing of the house, behind the partially collapsed wall, she had been telling herself she would investigate when the weather improved and the light was better, and her courage caught up with her curiosity. Something exhaled in the dark. A faint displacement of air, barely perceptible, like breath from a space that should not be breathing, like a door opening somewhere far below where no door had any right to be. Seren stared at the wall for a long moment, her hands still resting on her belly, both children suddenly very still. Then she turned back to the fire and told herself it was the house settling against the cold. She did not believe it. The news arrived the way most unwelcome things did, without announcement and at the worst possible moment. Seren was at the village market when she heard the traders from the northern roads talking at the inn beside the square. She did not stop walking. She turned to examine a bolt of undyed wool at a nearby stall and let their voices come to her. The Alpha King had not taken a meal in 3 weeks. Not that he was unwell, not that he had been confined or treated by physicians. He had simply stopped eating, as if the machinery of the body required for ruling had decided it no longer required the things that bodies normally require. His personal guard had reportedly taken to leaving food outside his chamber door and returning to find it untouched. The court physicians had been summoned and dismissed so many times in so short a period that they had apparently begun waiting in the outer corridor as a matter of routine, on the theory that being already present was more efficient than being repeatedly sent for. The wolves had gone quiet. Not the restless, unpredictable quiet that preceded something violent. A different kind. The kind that descended when something fundamental had shifted and the packs could feel it in the air, but had no howl adequate to express it. Travelers from the capital described the city as suspended, holding a breath it did not know how to release. The celebration that had followed the rite of the hollow moon had lasted 3 days, and then simply stopped, replaced by a stillness the traders described with uncomfortable precision and no satisfying explanation. Seren paid for the wool she did not need and walked back to Ashvale without allowing herself to think about any of it. She almost managed it. That evening, after the light had faded and the children had stilled into the long, peaceful quiet they reserved for the hours before midnight, she stood in the doorway of the east wing with her lamp and looked at the collapsed section of wall she had been avoiding for 6 weeks. She had been telling herself she was waiting for better conditions, warmer weather, a moment when she had the energy to deal with whatever was on the other side of a wall that had no logical reason to be producing the faint displacement of air she had felt on the 43rd night. She had told herself it was the house settling against the cold. She had been telling herself that every night since. She picked up her lamp and walked through the gap in the collapsed masonry. The door was there, exactly as it had been the moment she had first seen it, and immediately looked away from. Iron-banded and low-arched, set into the original stonework with a precision intended to last and not to be found. It sat in its frame with the stillness of something that had not been opened in a long time. Except that when Seren pressed her palm flat against the wood, the faintest possible current of air moved against her skin from the gap beneath its lower edge. Whatever was on the other side of this door was not sealed. She stood with her hand against the wood and felt the children respond to the contact, both of them shifting in the alert, attentive way they reserved for moments when something significant was occurring. The wild one pressed outward against her palm with unmistakable insistence, as if it had a clear opinion about what she should do next. She pulled the door open. The staircase beyond descended in a tight spiral into darkness that her lamp addressed only partially. The steps were stone, worn smooth at their centers in the way of stairs that had carried regular traffic for a long time. Iron brackets lined the walls at intervals, empty now, their torches long since exhausted. The air that rose from below was cool and dry in a way that suggested the space at the bottom was larger than the staircase implied. And from somewhere in that darkness, at the base of the spiral where her lamp's reach ended, she heard it again. Not breath. Not the sound of an animal or a person. Something slower and more measured, like the sound a room makes when it has been holding something on behalf of someone who has not returned for it. Seren stood at the top of the staircase and felt the mark on her wrist pulse once, deep and deliberate, like a heartbeat that was not her own. She did not descend. Not tonight. She closed the door carefully and stood in the dark of the east wing with her lamp, and understood that whatever was at the bottom of that staircase had been waiting considerably longer than 6 weeks. It could wait one more night. Ronan arrived at Ashvale the following afternoon, which told Seren 2 things immediately. That he had been closer than she realized, and that he had been watching the house long enough to understand something about the rhythms of it before he chose to approach. People who waited for the right moment to make themselves known were either careful allies or careful enemies. And she met him at the door before he knocked, because she needed to see his face before she decided which. He stopped on the path and looked at her, and something in his expression shifted in the way of a man who has been carrying a difficult thing for a long time and has finally been given somewhere to set it down. You are harder to find than anyone gave you credit for, he said. You found me, Seren replied. Eventually. A pause. I am Ronan, first beta to the Alpha King. I have been searching for you for 7 weeks. She stepped back from the door. He entered and moved through the ground floor the way trained wolves always did, cataloging exits and angles of approach with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with habit. She poured him water because she had nothing else worth offering and gestured toward the chair beside the fire. He sat and looked at her with the steady, direct gaze of someone who had decided that everything depended on the next several minutes proceeding honestly. He did not choose her, Ronan said. The words arrived in the room with a weight the room had not been built to hold. Seren kept her face still. I was there, she said. I heard him speak her name. You heard a man speak words that had been arranged in his mouth without his knowledge or consent. Ronan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he placed on the table without pressing her to take it. 3 days before the rite of the hollow moon, a compound was introduced into the king's evening meal. Something derived from highland root extracts combined with elements we are still working to fully identify. It suppressed the wolf, severed the connection between his instincts and his actions. He stood in that courtyard and performed the rite with no access to the bond, no access to his wolf, no access to anything except the instructions that had been arranged inside him by whoever administered the compound. Seren's hands were very still in her lap. That cannot be done, she said. The bond cannot be severed by a compound. It cannot be permanently severed, Ronan said. What was done to him was a temporary and carefully timed severance, calibrated to last through the rite, and no longer. He woke the following morning with the full bond intact, and no memory of the ceremony except what others told him had occurred. A pause. The first thing he did was go to your rooms. The kitchen was completely silent. Who administered it? Seren said. It was not a question. Ronan's expression shifted into something that was not quite sympathy and not quite apology, but contained elements of both. Marin, he said quietly. The name landed in Seren's chest like something thrown from a great height. Marin. Who had trained her? Who had pressed herbs into her hands and corrected her measurements, and sat through the long nights of a difficult apprenticeship without impatience? Who had been the first person at Ravenspire to show her uncomplicated kindness when she arrived as a girl with a gift she did not yet know how to carry? Who had looked at her on the morning of the rite and said she looked well and should eat before the evening? No, Seren said. Her daughter was taken by House Morin 6 months before the rite. They told Marin that if she administered the compound as directed and ensured you were not in any position where the king might encounter you before the ceremony, her daughter would be returned unharmed. Ronan's voice was level and careful, the voice of someone who had chosen accuracy over gentleness as the more honest form of respect. She had no choice. She believed she was choosing her child's life over a political ceremony. She did not know about the bond. She did not know what she was truly dismantling. Seren looked at the floor. She had spent 2 months building her understanding of that night on the foundation of Kaelin's betrayal, had used that structure to hold herself upright through the worst weeks, the way a person uses fury to stand in for grief, when grief is too large to carry alone. And now, Ronan was telling her, the foundation had never existed. That the man who had spoken another woman's name before 10,000 witnesses had been as much a victim as she was. That the only person in that courtyard operating from genuine choice had been Seraphine of House Morin, wearing triumph on her face because she had earned it through years of calculated, patient cruelty. Where is Marin now? She said. Safe, in the king's custody. Her daughter was recovered before any of this reached you. Seren nodded once. Then, because she needed to know and was not certain she could ask it afterward, she said, What has he been doing? Since the morning after the rite? Ronan looked at her steadily. Searching for you. Every waking hour, and several that are not waking. A pause. For the first 4 weeks, before we had any trace of your location, he slept outside the eastern gate of Ravenspire every night. In wolf form, at the exact place where the bond told him you had last been present. He said if he moved further inside the walls, the signal diminished. Something that had been armored inside Seren's chest for 2 months, quietly and completely gave way. She did not speak for a moment. There is something else, Ronan said. He reached into his coat a second time and produced a smaller document, sealed with a crest she recognized before he had finished placing it on the table. The silver serpent of House Morin pressed into dark wax. This was intercepted 4 days ago. It was addressed to parties we have not yet been able to fully identify. Its contents are not ambiguous. Seren picked it up and read it. The message was brief and entirely without disguise. Her location at Ashvale had been confirmed. The matter would be resolved before the new moon. Lord Daveth Morin sent his regards to no one in particular. 4 days ago, Seren said. Yes, said Ronan, which means they were already moving when you left to find me. Yes, said Ronan, which is why I came directly. Outside, the forest that bordered the Ashvale grounds had gone perfectly still. The kind of stillness that belonged not to a quiet afternoon, but to a space from which everything that knew what was approaching had already moved away. Seren set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she stood. I need to show you something, she said. Ronan's wolves found the first sign at the tree line before Seren had finished explaining the door. She had brought him to the east wing and shown him the gap in the collapsed masonry and the door beyond it, and had just begun to describe the staircase when one of the 3 wolves he had brought as escort appeared at the window, shifting mid-stride into human form and landing with the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that could not wait. The forest to the north had 3 separate approach lines disturbed. The disturbance was recent and coordinated. Ronan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went much focused in the way of a man running rapid calculations with a limited and diminishing amount of time. He looked at Seren. How many interior positions does this house have that cannot be approached from outside? The east wing, Seren said, and whatever is below it. Ronan looked at the door and then at her. Then that is where you go. Now. I have not yet been all the way down. Now is an adequate time to start. The staircase was longer than she had expected. She counted 24 steps in the spiral before the walls opened outward and the ceiling rose, and she understood that she was standing in something that had been constructed with deliberate intention rather than simply excavated. The chamber was perhaps 12 feet across, with a low vaulted ceiling and walls of dressed stone. Several iron lamp brackets held candles burned down to their final inch. The air was cool and completely dry. The chamber was not empty. A table stood against the far wall with a chair drawn up to it, and on the table, arranged with a neatness that suggested someone had left these things expecting to return, were a collection of objects. Maps, rolled and held with cord. A leather journal worn at the corners. A small wooden case of the kind used for writing materials. And beside the case, held flat beneath a smooth river stone, several sheets of paper covered in handwriting she recognized before she had crossed half the distance to the table. She recognized it because she had spent 4 months reading notes left in that hand. Notes placed on the corner of the observatory work table when he arrived before she did. Marginal corrections on the territory maps he had pressed into her hands, asking her to review, because she found inconsistencies that his advisors missed, and he had wanted her to know that he knew it. Kaelin had been here. Not years ago. The candles were not ancient. The pages had not yellowed. Someone had been using this chamber in the months preceding her arrival, and had left it with the clear expectation of returning. She picked up the first page. It was a letter, begun and then stopped, and then resumed. The evidence of the pauses visible in slight variations in the ink. The date at the top was 3 days after the rite of the hollow moon. He had come here 3 days after the rite. She read it standing at the table with one hand pressed to her belly and her lamp held steady in the other, and she understood with each line why it had never been sent. Not because it had been abandoned in despair, but because there had been no address to send it to. He had written it in the only direction he could feel her in, which was nowhere specific and everywhere at once, and he had written it anyway because not writing it had been impossible. It covered 2 full pages. It was detailed in the way that only honesty ever is, addressed to her by name, and it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. At the bottom of the second page, set apart by space above and below, he had written one sentence. I should have told you sooner that I had already chosen you. Not the night the bond declared itself. Before that. Long before that. Seren stood in the chamber beneath the Ashvale estate and held the letter in both hands and felt the last wall she had built around her broken heart quietly and completely dissolve. From the staircase above her, Ronan's voice came down, low and urgent. They are at the outer wall, he said. She folded the letter once, with the same care she gave to compounds that could not afford to spill, and placed it inside her healer's satchel. Then she looked at the chamber one final time, at the maps and the journal and the evidence of a man who had been coming to this place to be close to the direction of her, and she straightened her spine, and she turned to face the staircase. Then we do not keep them waiting, she said. The sounds came in sequence, the way sounds always do when violence is organized rather than spontaneous, each one arriving just far enough after the last to suggest coordination rather than chaos. First, the outer wall, something heavy against the stone. Then, a sharp crack from the northern face of the grounds where the old gate had been standing on its hinges for 3 decades on hope alone. Then voices, plural and low, giving instructions in the clipped, economical way of people who had rehearsed this arrangement before they arrived. Seren stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened. Above her, Ronan had positioned his wolves at the 2 ground-floor entries and the long corridor that connected the east wing to the main house. She had heard him move them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before, placing bodies in space the way a healer places instruments, each one where it would be most needed. 3 wolves. Against however many Lord Davith Morin had decided the problem of 1 pregnant healer in a crumbling estate required. She looked around the chamber. The candles on the table had been lit from her lamp, and now threw soft, shifting light across the dressed stone walls and the objects Kaelin had left here in the weeks after the rite. She had the letter in her satchel. She had the satchel across her chest. Both children were awake and alert, the wild one pressing steadily outward with a focused intensity she had not felt from it before, as if something in the sounds filtering down through the stone had sharpened its attention to a single point. From above, a sharp sound, then a voice she did not recognize saying something short and final, and then a silence that was worse than the sounds had been. Seren pressed her back against the far wall of the chamber and breathed deliberately, the way she had taught others to breathe, when the body's alarm responses were outrunning the situation's actual requirements. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The children needed her steady. They had needed her steady for 2 months, and she had managed it, and she would manage it now. The door at the top of the staircase opened. She had not heard footsteps on the spiral. Whatever had opened that door had either moved without sound through trained intention, or had not needed the stairs at all, and there was only one kind of thing that did not need stairs in a house where it could hear every heartbeat below ground. The figure that appeared at the top of the staircase was not one of Ronan's wolves. He descended 3 steps and stopped, and looked at her across the lamplight with an expression she had not seen on a human face before. It was the expression of a man who had been operating at the absolute outer edge of himself for a long time and had just stepped back inside the boundary of what was bearable. Kaelin. Not as she had last seen him, composed in the terrible way of the drugged and the violated, his eyes performing a ceremony his wolf had been locked out of. As himself. As the man who had stood at the observatory window at the end of long evenings and told her things about governance and grief that he had never said to anyone else in her presence. as the man who had pressed his mouth to her wrist above the bond mark the first time, and looked up at her afterward as if she had been the surprise. He looked at her, and at the satchel across her chest, and at the space between them. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "No," she said. He descended the remaining steps and stopped in the center of the chamber at a distance that was not close and not far, and was clearly intentional, as if he understood that closing it without permission was the last thing he would do. His eyes moved once more to the satchel, and she understood that he could feel, through the bond, what she was carrying. That he had felt it from the moment he entered the range of her, and had been absorbing it on the way down the stairs. "You have been here," she said, "before me." "Yes. You left letters. I did not know where to send them." A pause. "I came here because the bond told me this was where you had been longest. I could not feel you clearly anywhere else. I thought if I was in the place where you had been, in the rooms where your presence was still in the air, that I could hold the connection open." He looked at the table with its maps and its worn journal. "I was not wrong." From the floor above, the sounds had shifted. Ronan's voice, somewhere out of sight, saying something crisp and commanding. Then footsteps, several sets, moving in a direction that suggested retreat rather than engagement. Kalen did not take his eyes off Seren. "Ronan brought more than 3 wolves," she said. "Ronan brought me." He looked at her steadily. "The others I sent ahead of us when we identified the approach lines. I came through the east boundary because it was the fastest route to you." A pause, and something moved briefly across his face that was not composure and did not pretend to be. "I was not going to arrive at any other pace." The wild one pressed against her palm with a sudden, unmistakable insistence. Seren looked at Kalen across the lamplight and felt the bond between them, which had not dimmed or diminished in 2 months of distance, and 1 night of deliberate dismantling, pull at the center of her chest like a tide that had finally turned. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "That you had already chosen." His breath went out. "Yes," he said. "I should have." The silence that followed was not empty. It held everything they had not said in 4 months of observatory evenings and territory maps, the tension of 2 people who know exactly what they are to each other and have not yet spoken it aloud. It held 2 months of separation and all the nights she had built her grief on a foundation that had just been unmade. It held the children, both of them still and attentive, and the letter in her satchel, and the single sentence at the bottom of the 2nd page. She crossed the distance between them. She moved without calculation, and he did not step back. His arms came around her with a steadiness that existed in the space between urgency and restraint. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the bond seal itself back into something whole. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held her, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Above them, Lord David Moran's men were being escorted off the grounds at a pace that left no room for argument. They sat at the table in the underground chamber while Ronan secured the house, and Kalen read the letters he had left in the order he had written them, not because she asked him to, but because she handed them to him one by one, and he understood that this was how she needed it to proceed. She needed him to be the one holding them while she watched his face, reading the man rather than the documents. She had always trusted what she could observe directly over what she was told to accept. He read without speaking. She watched the way his jaw worked at certain passages, and the stillness that came over him at others, and the single moment near the end of the 3rd letter where he stopped completely and sat with his eyes on the page, and breathed through something she had no name for, because she had never seen it on his face. A man accounting for himself to himself, in the presence of the only witness he would have accepted. When he finished, he set the letters down and looked at her. "I need to tell you what I remember," he said. "Tell me." He told her with the same accuracy he brought to everything, the same refusal to soften the parts that were difficult, which she had recognized in him before she could have said exactly why she trusted it. He told her what it had been like to wake the morning after the rite with the bond screaming in his chest, and the knowledge of what he had apparently done arriving through other people's accounts. He told her about the Eastern Gate, and the 7 weeks, and the quality of the silence in Ravenspire once the celebration had collapsed. He told her about Marin, which she already knew from Ronan, but she let him tell it because he needed to say it, and she needed to hear it from him. Her daughter is safe, he said. House Morin will be formally answered for what was done to Marin, for what was done to me through her, and for the letter intercepted 4 days ago. His voice was level in the way it always was when he had already decided what he was going to do. Lord Daveth and the Lady Seraphine will be summoned before the High Council within the fortnight. There will be a full accounting. And Seraphine, Seren said. Seraphine participated in the planning of a compound that severed a reigning king's bond connection during a sacred rite. There is no ambiguity in the law about what that constitutes. He looked at her steadily. She will not be in a position to threaten you again. Seren looked at her hands in her lap, felt the children shifting in the way they did when she was processing something large, and they were adjusting to the change in her internal landscape. The wild one in particular, always attuned to her emotional state with an accuracy that had not diminished as the weeks passed, and its presence grew more distinct. There are two, she said. The words sat in the air between them. She watched his face as the information finished arriving. He had known she was pregnant. The bond had told him that much from the moment he descended the stairs, but the number had been hers to give, and she saw the moment it landed. Something moved through him that was too large for his expression to contain and did not try to. Both strong, she said. The healer in Ashvale village confirmed it at 8 weeks. She paused. The wild one has been very decided about things from the beginning. Wild one, he repeated. It was easier to tell them apart by temperament than by position. She looked at him. The calm one watches. The wild one acts. They have been entirely consistent on this. Something shifted in his expression then, that was not composure, or the careful management of a man who led 10,000 wolves. It was simpler and more complete than any of those things. He looked at her, as if she was the fixed point in a space that had been moving without purchase for 2 months, and she understood, watching it happen in real time, that the version of him she had been carrying in her memory through the worst weeks had been accurate. She had not invented what they were to each other. It had been real the entire time, and it had survived what had been done to it, and it was still here, slightly worn at the corners, but intact. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, and said her name once, quietly. She turned her hand over and held his. There is still the matter of the summons, she said after a moment. The High Council. Ravenspire. She felt the children settle as she spoke, as if they could hear the shape of the future being arranged and had opinions about its general direction. I cannot return as what I was. No, he said. You cannot. The certainty in his voice when he said it told her everything she needed to know about what he was proposing instead. She did not answer immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with any compound of significant consequence, giving it the time required to understand what it actually contained. The idea of Ravenspire, which had been the place where her heart was broken, and which was also the place where she had stood at observatory windows in the long evenings and felt, for the first time in her life, that someone was genuinely interested in what she thought about the world. I will need time, she said. You have it. Not because I am uncertain. She looked at him. Because I want to return when I have decided to return. Not because I have been frightened back into the arrangement by a letter from House Morin. Something moved in his eyes that was unmistakably approval, which was one of the things she had never been able to construct in her imagination of him. It looked different on him than on other people. Not effusive. Simply a settling, a confirmation, as if something he had believed was true had just been verified. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will wait. You have been doing that for 7 weeks already. I have considerable practice now. A pause, and something that was almost a smile at the corner of his mouth. the rare kind that she had only ever seen in the observatory, when they were alone, and the formality of the crown had temporarily set itself down somewhere out of reach. I am told I have improved. Seren looked at him across the table in the lamplight, with both children quiet and attentive and present, and felt the weight of the last 2 months finally and completely set itself down. She was not certain she had forgiven everything. She was not certain she needed to decide that tonight. What she was certain of was that the man sitting across from her had not betrayed her, had suffered the same violations she had, at different angles, and had spent every night of the intervening weeks attempting to close the distance between them by the only means available to him. That was not a small thing. The morning came in through the upper windows of the Ashvale estate with the quality of late autumn light that seemed to commit to nothing but managed, despite this, to illuminate everything. Seren had slept in the room she had been using since her arrival, and for the first time in 2 months had done so without waking twice in the deepest hours to stand at the window and calculate distances. The bond was whole. She could feel Kaylin in the main hall of the house below her, present in the way of someone who has found what they spent 7 weeks looking for and has no intention of moving. She dressed and came downstairs and found him standing at the long table in the hall with Ronan, reviewing the territory maps she had left there in the 6th week, when she had started annotating the access roads out of old habit. He looked up when she entered and then at the maps, and she could see the moment he registered the corrections she had made in the margins. "The eastern road does not drain properly in the autumn," she said. "The army of records shows it passable in all seasons. It is not." "How did you determine this?" "I walked it in the rain." She looked at Ronan. "How many of Morin's men were accounted for last night?" 14 at the outer wall and 6 in the north approach." Ronan looked unsurprised by the question. "All secured and remanded, 2 of Lord Davith's personal guard among them, which removes any ambiguity about point of origin." Seren nodded and pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat. She had been thinking since before first light, in the way she thought through difficult problems, which was not to approach them directly, but to arrange all the elements she could identify, and then wait for the relationship between them to become clear on its own. House Morin had moved against her before the council summons, because they needed the problem of her removed before she could become the problem of her in a formal proceeding. That much was straightforward. What required more careful consideration was what she intended to do with the time between now and the fortnight Kaylin had indicated. "I want to go back to Ravenspire for the council session," she said. Both men looked at her. "I said you had time," Kaylin said. "You did. I have taken it." She looked at him steadily. "I spent 2 months building a life in this house on the premise that the version of events I believed was accurate. I organized everything I did around an understanding that was wrong. I do not want to organize anything further around waiting for the right moment. Because the right moment has presented itself, and I am capable of recognizing it." A pause. "I want to be present when Lord Davith and Seraphine stand before the High Council. I am not a secondary figure in what was done. I will not be treated as one." Ronan looked at Kaylin. Kaylin looked at Seren. There was a long moment of the silence that forms between two people who are still learning the exact dimensions of each other in a new arrangement. And then he inclined his head once, in the way she recognized from the observatory. Not concession, acknowledgement. "Then we leave when you are ready," he said. She spent the morning moving through the rooms of Ashvale with a thoroughness she had applied to every task since her arrival. She collected the things she had brought, and the small number of things she had acquired. She went to the east wing and down the staircase a final time to retrieve the remaining letters from the table, and the journal, because it belonged to him and should be returned to its owner, and also because she had not read it and thought he should be the one to decide whether it was the kind of document that survived the events it described. She carried everything back to the main hall in her healer's satchel and the single case she had arrived with, and stood in the doorway of the room she had slept in for 2 months, and looked at it once. It was a good room. It had been adequate shelter at a time when that was the entirety of what she needed. She did not feel sentimental about it, but she felt gratitude for the house and its inconvenient solidity and its hidden rooms, for the roof that had held, for the 43rd night and the faint displacement of air against her palm, for the waiting that had happened here, on both sides of the stone. She closed the door and walked downstairs. Outside, Kalen's wolves had assembled in the relaxed but complete readiness that characterized long service. Ronan was already mounted. Kalen stood at the foot of the entry steps and looked up at her as she came down, and then at the satchel and the case, and offered his hand at the last step. She took it, and they walked together to the horses. The children were quiet, both of them, in the way they had been the night before when the arrangement of the future was being discussed. She had come to understand their quietness as attention rather than absence. They were listening. They had been listening since before she had words to address to them, tracking every development of the situation with what she could only describe as interest. "They will need names," Kalen said. He had not released her hand. "I have been thinking about that." And she looked at him sideways as they walked, in the way she looked at things she was examining rather than simply seeing. "I had some thoughts about that in the 6th week. I put them in the journal. I did not know if they were permanent thoughts or temporary ones, and I did not want to decide alone." He was quiet for a moment. "You were choosing names for my children and writing them in a journal in my house." "In the chamber beneath your house." "In the chamber beneath my house," he repeated. Something moved in his voice that was not quite humor, but occupied its neighboring territory. "Without telling me, you were not available." She looked forward at the road leading south toward Ravenspire and the full accounting that was finally and irrevocably coming. "You are available now." He pressed her hand once, with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision considerably longer ago than either of them had acknowledged, and had simply been waiting for the architecture of the world to arrange itself into a shape where the decision could be properly expressed. "Tell me," he said. And as the Ashvale estate released them into the autumn morning, the estate with its hidden rooms and its long patience and its evidence of all the ways two people can keep faith across the distance of a deliberate cruelty, she did. The road south took 3 days, which was 2 days longer than it needed to be, and precisely as long as Seren required. Kalen did not press the pace. She understood this was a choice rather than an oversight, the same way she understood most of his choices, by the fact that everything he did was considered, and nothing happened around him by accident. He set the pace at the speed of a traveling healer with a full satchel and 2 months of disrupted sleep behind her, and when she glanced at him on the first afternoon to see if this bothered him, he was looking at the road ahead with the same focused calm he brought to everything that required patience. They camped on the first night in a valley where a stream ran shallow over flat stones, and the trees had begun to release their leaves in the unhurried way of things certain the season will return. Ronan's wolves took the outer positions and left them the fire, and Seren sat close to the warmth with her hands around a cup of tea, watching Kalen on the other side of the fire reading the journal she had returned to him. He read for a long time without speaking. She did not watch his face the way she had in the underground chamber. This was different. The reading a person does alone, or as alone as they can be in the presence of someone they have already permitted past every useful boundary, and she let him have it. She looked instead at the fire and let her mind move through the things that required arranging. Ravenspire would be a different problem than it had been before. She had left it as the bondmaid of the Alpha King and something else that had no formal category, present in the private life of the crown and invisible in its public one. She would return as something the court had no existing framework for, and she had no illusions about what that would require. Courts did not reorganize their assumptions quietly. They reorganized them loudly and with significant resistance. She was not concerned. She had spent 4 months at Ravenspire watching how Kalen moved through a court that had opinions about everything he did, and she had formed her own views about which opinions were worth addressing directly, and which ones resolved themselves once they understood they were not going to produce the effect they were designed to produce. She had also spent 2 months managing a household and a pregnancy, and the complete dismantling of her previous understanding of her own life. She had considerably more range than anyone at Ravenspire had yet had the opportunity to observe. Kalen closed the journal. He held it in both hands for a moment without speaking, his eyes on the fire, and then he looked up at her. "Oren," he said quietly, "and Crescent." Those were the names she had written in the 6th week, when she had been certain she was choosing alone. She looked at him across the fire. "The calm one and the wild one," he said, "in the order you wrote them." A pause. "They are the right names." She felt the children shift as if they had heard him, the wild one with its characteristic decisiveness, and the calm one with its characteristic consideration, and she understood from the quality of the movement that they agreed with his assessment. "Yes," she said. "They are." They sat with the fire between them and the names hanging new and deliberate in the autumn air, and it was the closest thing to peace that Seren had felt in 2 months, which was to say, it was imperfect and preliminary, and more than sufficient. On the second morning, she walked the section of the road that her notation had marked as impassable in the rain, and verified that conditions had been precisely as she described, and made an additional note in the margin of the territory map about the drainage issue at the lower junction that the Army of Record had also missed. Kalen watched her do this without comment. Ronan watched her do it with the expression of a man filing something away for future reference. On the third day, toward evening, the towers of Ravenspire came visible above the tree line. She looked at them for a long moment from the crest of the road. Then she looked forward and rode down into the valley, and did not look back at the space behind her. She had left Ravenspire a woman building her life on a promise. She was returning as someone who had learned, in the most difficult way available, the difference between a promise kept and a promise taken from the man who made it. That difference mattered. She intended to make it visible. The High Council of the Northern Pax convened 4 days after their arrival at Ravenspire, in the long hall with the vaulted ceiling and the tiered seating that had been designed to impress the people required to stand before it. Seren had passed through that hall twice during her months at court, and had on both occasions observed the way the architecture worked to diminish the person at its center. The high windows placed the light behind the seated council members. The stone floor amplified every sound in the direction of the audience and absorbed it toward the dais. It was a room that had been built to produce a specific result in specific people, and it did its work with considerable efficiency. She stood at the center of it and felt nothing in particular. Lord David Morin entered from the left corridor with his legal advisors arranged around him in the clustering posture of men who understood that proximity to power was currently their most useful credential. He was a large man with the ingrained confidence of someone who had spent decades understanding that the world would accommodate itself to his preferences if he pressed firmly enough and long enough. He looked at Seren when he entered and away from her again, in the way of a man who has decided in advance what something is and does not see the value in examining it further. Seraphine entered behind him. She had wanted the crown for years and had spent half that time arranging the means to take it. She looked at Seren the way she had looked at her on the night of the rite, with the composed certainty of a woman who had spent years arranging outcomes in advance, and was accustomed to being in a room where all the arrangements were her own. Then she looked at Kalen, who was seated at the head of the council table, and something shifted in her expression that she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. He was not looking at Seraphine. He was looking at the council members to his left, speaking quietly to the eldest of them about a point of procedural record, and his complete lack of attention to Seraphine's entrance was not an oversight, and everyone in the room understood it. The proceedings were thorough, and they were long, and they were without ambiguity by the time they concluded. The compound was presented in its documented form, with the testimony of the 2 chemists who had identified its composition and the timeline of its introduction to Kalen's evening meal. Marin's account was delivered through written record at Seren's request, because Marin had suffered enough already and did not need to stand in a stone hall and account for a choice made under coercion to the satisfaction of people who had never been required to make it. The testimony of Morin household members who had been among the 14 at Ashvale's outer wall was entered with the names of Lord Deveth's personal guard confirmed in attendance. Seraphine's legal advisor spoke for 40 minutes with evident preparation and no visible effect. When the council deliberated, it took less time than the formal record required. Lord Davith Morin was remanded to the custody of the Northern Border Garrison pending a full accounting of House Morin's political correspondences over the preceding 3 years. Everyone present understood that the accounting would produce further findings, and those findings further proceedings, at a length proportional to what they found. He left the hall with the gait of a man who had pressed firmly against the world his entire life and had just encountered something that was not going to move. Seraphine was escorted from the hall by 2 of Kaylin's personal guard under the formal language of protective custody, which applied when charges had not yet been finalized, but the risk of interference was considered significant. She walked between them without speaking and did not look at Seren on her way to the door. Seren watched her go and felt nothing that resembled triumph. What she felt was something quieter and more lasting, the satisfaction of a wrong thing that has been correctly named and correctly addressed, and the knowledge that the naming and the addressing will hold. She sat in the gallery of the long hall while the formal record was being completed, with the autumn light coming through the high windows at the angle that placed it behind the council members, and felt the children respond to the stillness with their own assessments. Oren quiet and watchful. Crescent settled for perhaps the first time into a quality that Seren could only describe as satisfied. Ronan appeared beside her as the gallery emptied. "There are reporters from 4 separate territories waiting outside the north entrance," he said. "There will be more tomorrow." "Yes." A pause. "The court has questions." She looked at him. "The court can have answers when I have determined which questions are worth answering." She stood and smoothed the front of her coat. "Tell them the Luna of Ravenspire will receive formal inquiries through the council secretary beginning next week. That should occupy them adequately while I finish settling in." Ronan looked at her for a moment with the evaluating gaze he applied to significant new information. "Yes," he said. "It should." Winter came to Ravenspire the way it always did, according to those who had been there long enough to know, suddenly and without extensive warning, as if the season had been waiting just past the northern ridge for the moment when no one was watching the horizon. The first snow fell 11 days after the council proceedings concluded, and it fell over a city that was in the process of reorganizing its understanding of its own arrangement, and it settled on rooftops and market stalls and the long stone corridors of the palace with the indifference of weather toward human complication. Seren had moved into the East Observatory wing, which had been vacant, and was the room in Ravenspire from which she could feel the surrounding territory most clearly. This was partly practical, and partly something she had not fully explained to anyone, which was that she wanted to be in the highest room available when the children arrived, on the theory that Crescent in particular deserved the most expansive possible first view of the world she had been waiting impatiently to enter. She had been in the observatory for 3 weeks when she sent for the healer. Not because things were wrong, because things were exactly as they should be, and she had learned over a considerable number of difficult months to recognize the difference. Kaylin was in the room when it happened, which was where he had been every morning and every evening since their return, not hovering but present, in the way he occupied any space that required him, with the quality of someone who understood that readiness and interference were not the same thing. He was at the window when she called for him, and he crossed the room without haste, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was one of the things she had understood about him before she had words for it, that he knew when to move quickly and when to be still, and had the self-possession to choose correctly between them, regardless of his own feeling about the situation. He was with her through all of it. Oren arrived first, which was exactly consistent with everything Seren had observed over the preceding months, and lay in the receiving cloth with the wide-eyed attentiveness of someone who had been listening through the walls for a long time and was now taking an inventory of everything he had anticipated correctly. Dark hair. Kaylin's steady gray eyes already visible in the thoughtfulness of a newborn who seems to have formed opinions before the world has had adequate time to offer opinions to. Crescent arrived second, with the emphatic energy of a person who has been waiting at a door and has finally been permitted through it. Red gold at the crown of the head. Seren's own coloring. A voice that announced itself with considerable authority before the first breath was fully drawn. Kaylin held them in sequence, each one with the completeness of someone who understood this moment had weight and required the full attention he brought to everything that mattered. He looked at each of them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Seren. There was nothing in his expression she had not already seen at some point in the preceding months. The steadiness she had trusted before she could explain why. The quality of his attention when it was entirely on her. The almost smile from the observatory evenings, more complete now than it had ever been, because it had nothing left to manage itself against. But there was something else present in his face that had not been there before. The expression of a man holding the evidence that the thing he values most in the world has continued and expanded and is, by any reasonable assessment, going to continue further. She watched him carry it and felt she was watching something private, and did not look away. He sat on the edge of the bed, with one of them settled against each arm, Oren watching the snow outside the observatory window with focused consideration, and Crescent already attempting to determine the logistics of the situation with the exploratory energy she had never entirely abandoned, and he looked at Seren. "Oren," he said, to the calm one first. Oren looked at him with the gray-eyed attentiveness he had brought to everything so far. "Crescent," he said, to the wild one. Crescent made her opinion of this development known at moderate volume for approximately 3 seconds, then appeared to decide it was an acceptable arrangement, and was quiet. Seren laughed. It came out of her without arrangement or intention. The way things came out of her when she was genuinely surprised by something. And Kaylin looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was the truest version of the almost smile. The one that appeared when she was the thing he had not anticipated, but should have. "Consistent," she said. "Entirely," he agreed. Outside, snow continued falling on a city that was learning new names. The court reporters who had been waiting since the council proceedings would have their first answers by the following week. The territory maps in the observatory already carried her corrections in the margins. In the northern border garrison, Lord Deveth Morin was beginning to understand the depth of the accounting ahead of him. Ravenspire was not the same city she had left, neither was she the same woman who had left it, and the distance between those two facts was not a wound anymore, but a measure. A record of how far two people could travel through the worst kind of darkness and still find their way back to the same room, the same fire, the same certainty that had been there before either of them had the language to name it. Kaylin looked at her over the heads of their children, in the quiet of the first morning of winter, and she looked back at him with the same directness she had always given him, the directness that had caught his attention before the bond had declared anything at all. She reached for Crescent, who was voicing another announcement, brief and unambiguous. And the observatory, with its windows full of falling snow and its maps full of roads, she had walked herself and its long memory of two people standing at its windows talking through the evenings, held all of them in its high, unhurried light, and waited to see what they would build next.